Arsites, the satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, hastily summoned several generals to the town of Zelea, modern-day Sarıköy, about 20 miles from the Macedonian camp. Everyone present had their own opinion on how to defeat the Macedonians, but the most prudent advice came from Memnon of Rhodes, the leader of a Greek mercenary force serving the Persians. Memnon, who had visited Pella and had experience with Macedonian military tactics, knew that once Alexander ran out of the supplies he had brought, he would be forced to forage. Therefore, Memnon proposed devastating the region by burning crops and destroying towns if necessary, thus severely hampering Alexander's ability to feed his army and forcing him to retreat back to Macedonia. Naturally, Arsites was reluctant to approve Memnon's scorched earth policy within his own satrapy. He was also displeased with Memnon's blunt warning that the Persians should avoid a pitched battle with Alexander, given that their infantry was poorly trained and outnumbered. Alexander likely commanded about 40,000 infantry compared to the Persians' 30,000 or fewer. However, the Persians had 20,000 well-trained, battle-hardened Greek mercenaries and could field around 16,000 cavalry against Alexander's 6,000. Weighing these factors, Arsites decided he held the advantage over the invaders, particularly as his troops would fight on familiar terrain. Ignoring Memnon's objections, perhaps even due to disdain for him as a Greek, Arsites ordered an engagement. The Persians took up a position west of Zelea, overlooking the plain of Adrasteia, through which the Granicus river flowed. This site was likely near present-day Dimetoka. They camped on the eastern bank of the river. Alexander, leading 13,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry, marched to the western bank by late afternoon or at sunset. The Granicus was swift and about 3 feet deep, though its entire bed stretched some 80 feet wide. The terrain has changed little since Alexander's time, thus both the west and east banks were steep, around 12 feet high, and probably covered with the same kind of forest and brush as today. Crossing the river would be a struggle even under ideal conditions, let alone against an enemy army positioned along the opposite bank, ready to exploit any Macedonian misstep. That is why Parmenion tried to persuade Alexander to wait until he could find another route to outflank the enemy. Parmenion's advice was wise, but not what Alexander wanted to hear. He scornfully replied that he could never live down the shame of being stopped by a mere stream like the Granicus after crossing the Hellespont. At this point, our ancient sources disagree. Arrian claims that Alexander engaged the Persians that same evening, while Diodorus says he waited until the next morning to cross unseen. Arrian's version seems more likely, since Alexander was known for his preference for surprise attacks. Besides, it would have been difficult for the Persians not to notice thousands of Macedonians moving across the river in daylight. Diodorus also states that Arsites positioned his cavalry slightly back from the water's edge, with infantry on the hill above, whereas Arrian places the cavalry right at the riverbank, with infantry behind them. Diodorus's account is more plausible, as Persian infantry positioned along the riverbank could harass attackers with missile fire, disrupting their formations rather than trying to fight from behind their cavalry. Thus, the danger to Alexander was immense. He had to lead his men down the steep western bank, cross the river while neutralizing enemy cavalry, and climb the opposite bank under a hail of spears and arrows from above. Any error by any phalanx unit could immediately cause a disruption, and the resulting chaos would virtually guarantee a Persian victory. On the other hand, Alexander, familiar with rivers from his Macedonian upbringing, may have preferred to fight here rather than elsewhere, as Parmenion suggested. He observed that various bends in the river created slopes with gentler gravel inclines leading down to the water, often opposite each other, and decided to use these natural ramps. His plan was to lead his forces down one gravel slope into the river with cavalry protecting both flanks of the phalanx, crossing diagonally, likely pushed by the current, toward the nearest gravel bank on the opposite side to attack the Persians. Since Philip's time, the Macedonian phalanx had been trained to traverse all kinds of terrain, including running water, and Alexander was counting on them not to miss a beat now. Alexander's line stretched just over a mile. He placed his Thracian, Thessalian, and other allied Greek cavalry on his left flank under Parmenion's command. On the right were the Macedonian cavalry, which Alexander split into two groups, one under Philotas on the far right, and another under Amyntas positioned next to the densely packed centre phalanx. Alexander himself took a personal position nearby. The cavalry was drawn up 10 horses deep, while the infantry formations were 8 men deep. The Battle of the Granicus saw Alexander resort to a tactical feint. He ordered Amyntas and a small assault force of fast cavalry, prodromoi, to cross the river ahead of the main army, thus drawing the enemy's fire. As Alexander anticipated, the Persian cavalry charged at Amyntas's men and even managed to push them back. Meanwhile, Alexander and the right wing began moving across the river, followed by the center and left wing in a prearranged diagonal path toward the opposite gravel banks. By the time the Persians realized Amyntas's action was merely a diversion, they could not regroup in time, and their cavalry fell victim to Alexander's massive counterattack. As more and more Persian commanders were killed during the fighting, their cavalry lost heart and fled. The battle now turned into an infantry clash. Parmenion had successfully led his left wing across the river and reformed into a continuous line, advancing easily up the riverbank to face the Persian infantry and Greek mercenaries. The Persian ranks turned into a bloodbath as the Macedonian sarissas tore through the lightly armed Persians, whose javelins were no match for the long and deadly spears of their enemies. Demoralized, they fled after the cavalry. Alexander now turned his attention to the Greek mercenaries under Memnon, who had not yet engaged. Initially, Memnon sought terms, but Alexander, angered that Greeks would fight other Greeks, was in no mood for mercy. Without delay, the king reformed his troops into the usual wedge formation and, with cavalry on both flanks, launched a direct attack on the mercenaries. It is said that Alexander's forces fought even more fiercely against Memnon's troops than against the Persians. During the clash, Alexander's horse, apparently not Bucephalus, was killed beneath him. Eventually, the shock and terror tactics prevailed, and 18,000 mercenaries were cut to pieces. Memnon escaped, but 2,000 surviving mercenaries, including a group of Athenians, were captured and sent back to Macedonia to labor in the mines under chains. Arsites, who had fled into Phrygia, took full responsibility for the defeat and committed suicide. As for the barbarians, we are told that 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry fell. On Alexander's side, Aristobulus reports a total of 34 deaths, including 9 infantrymen. These figures were likely exaggerated to glorify the Macedonian victory, but regardless, this battle was a triumph of strategic planning, bold tactics, and Alexander's daring. It was his first victory on Asian soil and proved the superiority of his army over a numerically larger foe. The Battle of the Granicus began tolling the death knell for the Achaemenid dynasty.